Welcome, everyone. My name is Zachary Feder, and I'm here tonight with a very special guest to talk about a phenomenon that is often underappreciated in the usual conversations about the current geopolitical gravitational shifts taking place in the world. From a single superpower to multiple powers, from a supremacy in the West to one in the East. That is, of course, if you buy the party line that the deep pocket players have ever really resided in the West at all. And in the midst of this, a still nascent yet radically different kind of superpower is emerging. A sort of asymmetrical transnational movement of politicized, digitized, well-informed citizens that classic autocratic states have always feared and that are today beginning to shape the course of history almost as much as conventional national powers have done previously, with a vanguard that consists of an entirely new breed of mega whistleblowers that include Manning, Snowden, Drake, Wygon, and Assange, who stand on the shoulders of giants like Ellsberg and arguably the godfather of them all, Galileo, who blew the ultimate whistle on the church and the lie of heliocentricity, to say nothing of the journalists, advocates, and legal teams that continue to support them. Joining me tonight for this deep dive, great privilege, is the author of The Lucifer Principle, The God Problem, The Mohammed Code, The Global Brain, one of the most flattered men currently living on planet Earth. He's been called the next Darwin, Newton, and Einstein combined, and with good reason. He's an intellectual stargate, a meta-genius, a mass movement strategist, a rock and roll alchemist, born of a virgin birth, leaps large theories in a single bound. By his own admission, he accidentally started the 60s. By public verification, can execute 500 push-ups consecutively, though I still claim that you're not going all the way down, Howard. And by my own admission, is a national treasure who has some of the best parties east of Burning Man. Howard Bloom, welcome once again to the revolution.
Zach, you're a pleasure. And you got your handle on something very, very interesting here. Before we went on air, I was praising Zach for coming up with a term called the adaptogenic leader. And Zach was explaining that he has now substituted for that term the symphonic leader. And then Zach was kind enough to inform me that he wanted to discuss whistleblowers, and we were discussing the depths of the human mind. And what do the depths of the human mind have to do with whistleblowing? Everything in the world, because to run a democracy effectively, you need honesty. Democracy depends on the mass mind of its citizens, and they can only think as well as the information that they are given. And the Founding Fathers, as weird as it sounds, the Founding Fathers knew this, and they knew this because they were media obsessed. How can you tell they were media obsessed? Well, Ben Franklin was a printer who founded a newspaper. Newspapers were fairly new in the 1760s. When these guys got together, the Founding Fathers, to write a constitution, they wrote freedom of speech and freedom of the press as the very first elements of the Constitution. Freedom of press, that was, well, admittedly, printing press itself had been around for close to 300 years since Gutenberg invented it. But its use for what we call media today was a new thing. And these guys were basing an entire country on the right of people to know, and they were basing an entire nation on the concept of an informed citizenry. What is an informed citizenry? It's an average citizen who follows the news and knows what's going on. Now, when you've got, in the case of Bradley Manning is accused of having taken out of secrecy between 600 and 700,000 documents. The woman at the Washington Post who has researched the secrecy establishment seems to have discovered that there are approximately 4 million people with secrecy clearance. that means that not only do we have hundreds of thousands or millions of pieces of information that we're not allowed to know, but there is a tiny little aristocracy that has the right to something that the Constitution guarantees to every citizen, the right to be informed. And that violates the entire spirit of the Constitution, and the connection to the human mind is you've got 6 or 7 cells contending with themselves at every moment. Most of them hide themselves very, very well. But to actually run yourself effectively, you have to know them. Having clear insight into as many facts as the human mind can possibly understand is the answer to running yourself as an individual, and it's the answer to running a society, especially a democratic society. Does that connection make sense, Zach?
Absolutely. And I love the fact that you bring up the sheer number of classified documents. Every time I hear that number, and I wanted to ask you about this, I get this picture of, these immense structures that are trying to maintain their integrity, and yet for me that levels of secrecy are almost like the holes in Swiss cheese. They create this sort of vacuum that creates even more vulnerability, precisely really the reverse effect. The larger the secret, the more vulnerability there is for exposure.
Well, the more vulnerability there is for exposure, but the bigger the hole is in what we know and don't know. I mean, for example, I have a YouTube series, and I tend to break stories on the YouTube series that aren't being broken in the mainstream press. I mean, real stories, things you wouldn't otherwise know. And one of the things that gets me the most disturbed is that we've had 2 years of coverage of the Syrian civil war. And until recently, until John Kerry began to accepted a deal, John Kerry and Barack Obama accepted the deal that the Russians offered of removing the chemical weapons from the Syrian regime. Until then, we were told in every single story that this is a domestic squabble, it's a domestic civil war, and that it started with people in the street who were Twitter and Facebook fans who were calling for democracy. That's so far from the truth. It's ridiculous. This is a proxy war. It is a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It's a sock puppet war, and the Saudis have their fist in one of the socks, and the Iranians have their fist in the other. The figures vary this week. They go from 120,000 to 160,000. So between 120,000 and 160,000 people have been killed in the name of a war in which they are being used as pawns by these two major players. And you and I, citizens of the United States, should know this. Why? To make up our minds about what our government should do about this. But we've been kept from this information. Well, one day, I was invited to a party. There's a woman named Lally Weymouth, and she's very, very, very impressive. And her mother was Katharine Graham, the owner and publisher of the Washington Post. And Lally and her brother, until recently, owned and published the Washington Post. And I mentioned to Lally, I do a lot of Iranian and Saudi TV these days, which is very strange in its own way. And I mentioned to Lally that the Iranians had had me on in one-on-one debates, first with a senior official from Hamas, and then a senior official from the Muslim Brotherhood just 1 month before the Arab Spring. And Lally said, I'm having this party at the Lambs Club next week. Could you come? So I came, and it was not your ordinary party by any stretch of the imagination. A bunch of guys from Goldman Sachs got all excited and said, we've got to introduce you to Lloyd Blankfein. Lloyd Blankfein is the man who runs Goldman Sachs. I met Henry Louis Gates Jr. and all kinds of strange people. But eventually, as the room thinned, as the party petered out, I noticed somebody who looked very familiar way over on the other side of the room where I wouldn't have been able to see him when the crowd was still there. And I walked over and I shook his hand and I said, Henry, I just want to thank you for continuously making international affairs intellectually delicious. And he beamed, and then a bunch of younger women in their 50s, he's in his 80s, who obviously wanted to sleep with him but weren't going to say that, walked up and grabbed his attention. And meanwhile, there was a woman standing next to him. He was Henry Kissinger. And standing next to him was a woman about 6'2", wearing 4-inch heels. That's Nancy Kissinger. Now, Nancy Kissinger was known as an expert in international relations long before she met Henry Kissinger. I mean, she's way up there in knowing what's going on in the world. So Nancy and I stood there for 20 minutes jumping up and down about the fact that this thing in Syria is a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and that Americans should know about it, meaning that our journalists are derelict. They are not keeping us properly informed. And it wasn't until, we were 20 minutes into this, because we were very animated about this, angry about this, that I realized that Lally Weymouth and Don Graham, the owners of the Washington Post, were standing 10 feet away from us. They were our hosts. And those are the very people that we were talking about. That is the press, that and the New York Times. But if we are ignorant, Zach, if we are lobotomized, if we are kept from knowing the facts, how can this be a democracy? How can this be a government based for its legitimacy on the informed opinion of its citizens? The word informed is being destroyed. It is being amputated. It is being drawn and quartered. And Bradley Manning and Edward Snowden are heroes because they understand the Constitution Barack Obama swore to uphold and is not upholding, despite the fact that I voted for him twice. He isn't. That's a rant, but
and there are so many. And whenever you speak, there are always several different bifurcating areas that I just want to go, and I think maybe. Well, for starters, there's that whole strange, interesting sleight of hand that took place in the UN. I don't know if you want to go there about Saudi Arabia being invited to be part of the Security Council and then denying it as if it was some sort of peace prize or something, or as if like.
Well, that was. I don't know if you saw my YouTube on that. I followed the Syrians, or mostly the Saudis and the Iranians, like a hawk. They're very, very important. If you want to understand world affairs, if you're at all curious about it, you need to know what these players are up to, and China, and Africa, and a good many others. But I
want to hear that, Howard, and I want to hear what you have to say about that, and especially because in a way, the minute they do that. That's a bigger gesture than if they'd said yes. For me, that was a pulling back of an enormous curtain in some way. And I would love you to go there, but I want to mention Messenger, who's just, I have to admit, just to pronounce his name slightly flares my nostrils. But I have to say, as much as I have enjoyed his writings, whenever he and Brent Snowcroft and Brzezinski get together, they're always having conversations that I feel, if you were in the room, would be outed as really being, a top level of a three-dimensional chessboard that we are really not acknowledging those bottom two levels.
And you and I are not supposed to know about them. The press is remarkably shallow. It's astonishingly shallow. There are some good stories every once in a while in the New York Times. There are some good stories in the Washington Post. But we've had close to 3 years of coverage of the Syrian situation with almost no mention of who's really involved and what's really at stake. I mean, you've never heard the name Brigadier General Qasem Soleimani. Brigadier General Qasem Soleimani runs the Quds Force in Iran. The Quds Force is a part of the IGRC, the Iranian Guard Corps. The Quds Force is a sort of foreign legion, but it even goes beyond that. It's an organization that's responsible for putting together armies in other people's countries and then controlling them. So it controls 2 armies in Iraq. 2 proxy armies. Basically, Iran owns Iraq these days. And we could go into that at great length, and I could tell you the whole story of how they did it and how they actually were the Iranian intelligence, the head of Iranian.
We helped them, didn't we?
Oh, they spent 1 million lives and $1 trillion over the course of 8 years trying to get Saddam Hussein out of power so they could take over Iraq. And they failed. They fought to a stalemate. Then they came up with, remember the old ad for cereal, and these 3 little kids are sitting around a table, and the 2 older kids are afraid to try it, and they say, let's get Mikey to do it, because Mikey's only 1.5 years old. Well, it was the let's get Mikey to do it strategy. The Iranians, when they failed, And they had advanced rockets that they were raining down upon the cities in Iraq, and the Iraqis had rockets they were firing back. This is a modern war. And when they realized their weapons wouldn't cut it, they came up with something much more clever. They fed a batch of information on, see if you've ever heard this phrase before, weapons of mass destruction through a man named Ahmed Chalabi to the White House, the Pentagon, the CIA, and the Congress. And most important of all, they fed that information to 60 Minutes. They supplied Ahmed Chalabi with genuine, authentic defectors from the Iraqi military who were able to tell you firsthand how they had helped put together the 450 nuclear sites that Saddam Hussein had. Why did he have 450 nuclear sites? Because if the Americans ever tried to bomb him, they could hit 400 and he'd still have 50 and could put together a bomb in a second. And they told us firsthand how they had bought the trucks into which they had installed biological weapons facilities so that these trucks would be moving biological weapons factories. All those stories were told to us on 60 Minutes. Who can doubt 60 Minutes? Guess what? All of these were phonies. And they were all fed to us by Iranian intelligence. Why? Because if you can't do it yourself, get Mikey to do it. You know, if you spend $1 trillion and it hasn't worked, why not get Mikey to spend $3 trillion and do it for you? And we did. And General Qasem Soleimani declared victory in Iraq 2 years ago. And the man, Nouri al-Maliki, the prime minister of Iraq, guess where he spent his 20 years of exile? From Iraq. Iran. Iran owns Iraq right now for all practical purposes. The Quds force that Qasem Soleimani runs, Brigadier General Qasem Soleimani, also controls Hezbollah. If you read Hezbollah's founding document, it was founded with Iranian money, and it pledges allegiance to the principles of the Ayatollah Khomeini. Now, who is the Ayatollah Khomeini? He's the founding father of modern religious Iran, which is Iran. The religious guys, the imams, run the government, period. Their principles are written into the Constitution. He's the George Washington of Iran. He's the person who is quoted all over the place in Iran. Well, he's also quoted in the founding document of an organization called Hezbollah that's not in Iran. It's in Lebanon. So that's another proxy army. They also supply weapons to and exercise control over Hamas. And the Saudis feel that they have proxy armies in Yemen. Now, it's hard to tell whether the Saudis are accurate about this or whether they're just being paranoid. This is why the Saudis are trying to get rid of the current head of the government in Syria, because Syria is also an Iranian asset. Now, Syria is very independent, and the Assad family has run Syria now it's in its second generation. It's probably run the country for about 50 years in total. But Bashir Assad is a solid, totally committed Iranian ally in the same way that the United States, Britain, and France are allies. And so the Saudis feel encircled. They feel trapped. They feel it's the end of genuine Islam, that Islam is about to be destroyed. Why? Because those guys over in Iran, in their view, are not Muslims. They are turncoats. They have fallen for a false belief, Shiism. The Saudis are Sunnis, which is mainstream Islam, and the Iranians are not Sunnis. They are Shiites, and the Sunnis consider that to be worse than Satanism. Because if you leave genuine Islam and you pervert Islam, that is worse than being an unbeliever, and being an unbeliever is a cause for death. So the Saudis are scared to death of the Iranians. They feel encircled by these 5 proxy armies that are run by Brigadier General Qasem Soleimani. And then in the other sock puppet, that is the Saudi sock puppet, they're trying to knock over Bashir Assad to remove Syria from the Iranian axis and thus weaken the Iranian axis. And that's what the civil war in Syria is really all about. And the Saudis brought in from the wings a man who had been retired. His name is Prince Bandar. Now, Prince Bandar was their representative in Washington, and he was regarded as the sort of the fourth member of the White House because he practically lived in the White House. He had kind of access to our presidents for roughly 30 years that was absolutely unparalleled. Nobody else could come anywhere near it. And the Saudis have always had a very strong relationship, a very strong ability to manipulate the United States. For example, in 1948, when when Israel was declared as a state, and 5 Arab countries were about to go in and wipe it off the face of the map, and they swore they were going to wipe it off the face of the map in 24 hours. They had aerial reconnaissance photos of the military layout in Israel that very day. You know where they got it? They got it from the secret files of the American Air Force. They got it through a company called Bechtel, which is a huge construction conglomerate in the United States. It's like Carlyle Group. If you remember the first George Bush administration, George Bush the elder.
That's a Dick Cheney asset. Yeah, it's a Dick Cheney asset.
Yeah, well, in the same way that Dick Cheney from the Carlyle Group, which is another one of these huge organizations, in the same way Dick Cheney came from the Carlyle Group, many of the members of the cabinet for the original George Bush, the first George Bush, came from the Bechtel Group. And the Bechtel Group had access to the Air Force secret files and gave secret reconnaissance photos to the Saudis. And people have asked me, well, what's your source on that? What's your source? There's a very good book on Bechtel. I have to look it up on Google. It's about 30 years old. And it has the data. Now, why would Bechtel do such a thing? Because Bechtel was doing a lot of work for the Saudis, and the Saudis have a lot of money. It's called oil money, and they're really big clients. So the Saudis have been secretly controlling a lot of our policy for a very long time. There are very strong reasons to believe. Most people do not remember, but we had a war in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the 1990s. We got involved in it in a very big way. We spent a lot of money on it. Why would we get involved in a war in Bosnia and Herzegovina? Because the Saudis wanted us to. The Saudis they had madrasas, which some journalists have called suicide bomber factories. They're kinds of schools that school you in extremist Islam, jihadist Islam. They had many madrasas in Bosnia. And they were offering to the mothers of martyrs, the mothers of people who died trying to kill unbelievers, they were offering them $10,000 apiece, the Saudis. And the Saudi role in that particular war has never really been examined, but it needs to be examined. So the Saudis have exerted all this influence, and here's how the Iranians got me on their television channel for the first time. The Iranians know that I am, and your audience is going to boo and hiss, but the Iranians know that I am a Zionist, an atheist, and a Jew. Those are 3 reasons they would want me dead. You wouldn't think they would want me, but for some reason they wanted me on their television station when they opened it in the United States. Press TV is their English language television station, about 6 years ago or so. And they kept begging me to be on, and I kept refusing because why would I want to appear on a state-owned television station when that state wants me dead for 3 different reasons? Not just 1, 3. And then they finally called, and there was a big book by a couple of authors named Mearsheimer and Wald about the Israel lobby, and I was pissed off at that book. I was really angry at that book. The Iranians called, and they said, could we have you on to discuss the Israeli lobby? Well, wow. I mean, that was an issue I was so teed off about. Nobody else was asking me to talk about it. I really wanted to talk about it. So I called a bunch of people who are way up there in the Jewish community in political affairs, who are experts in things like Islamic terrorism in the United States and stuff like that, the kind of strange subjects that interest me. And I said, okay, I want to know. I had figured out exactly how much the Israel lobby spends every year in America, and I wanted to know how much the Islam lobby spends. And they said, Islam lobby? what's the Islam lobby? And I said, well, remember, there are only 15 million Jews on the entire planet Earth. That's less than the population of just one Muslim city. But there are 49 Muslim countries. Every single one of them employs people on Avenue K. Every single one of them employs lobbyists and publicists. And there are 1.8 billion of those people, according to Muslim figures. Muslims, 1.8 billion Muslims in 49 countries. How much do they spend in aggregate? And nobody could tell me. So I did the research on my own and discovered the following. I was only able to find the figure for what one Muslim country spends on lobbying and publicity in Washington. That was Saudi Arabia. Now, let me give you a startling figure. For every man, woman, and child in America, Israel spends a penny a year in lobbying and publicity. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot of money, Zach, but there are over 300 million Americans. Add that money up, and it comes to quite a bit. For every man, woman, and child in America, how much do you suspect Saudi Arabia spends per year?
Golly, I don't know, $1.
$13.79.
Oh.
That's just one out of 49 Muslim countries. And what do they get for their money? They get the most ironic thing of all. They get not only enormous influence, they get invisibility. Somehow the Saudis have bought themselves invisibility, and that gets us back to the UN seat and why they declined it. They declined it because they don't want anybody to see how they feel, what they want, and what they are doing. It's as simple as that. Now, when I do these episodes on YouTube about this, people keep asking for my sources, and the sources are in the hundreds or thousands because I've been studying this since I was a teenager. And a lot of the sources can be found in a book that you can find on smashwords.com called The Muhammad Code, which tells the story of how Muhammad himself invented jihadism and what we think of as Muslim extremism. And I don't generally tell anybody about that book because it could make me very... I'm not concerned about being unpopular in Muslim circles. I am extremely popular in Muslim circles. How many people have you ever met who've not only been on Saudi television and Iranian television numerous times on a regular basis, but they also yeah, go ahead.
Speaking of the Iranian,
they snookered me into Syrian television last month. They didn't tell me what I was doing it for. So
hold on, Howard.
Go ahead.
Just for the people, though, just for the people who maybe aren't used to diving so deeply, how would you reconfigure the narrative that we have recently with the new Iranian premier, who seems, much more amenable than his predecessor, and despite the fact that maybe we've been in a long-standing covert cyber war against their nuclear program with the Stuxnet virus and other things, how do you explain all the lovey-doveyness that seems to have accompanied this in relation, to what we get in the mainstream and what you've just outlined for us?
Well, it seems simple to me. I can always be wrong. Remember, I study this stuff like a hawk. And most of my material, by the way, for everything that I've been saying, does not come from Western sources. It comes from Muslim sources. The Iranians, the Saudis, say that the Iranians have the most sophisticated, intelligent, clever, devious machinery for deception that has ever been seen in the history of the world. Now, remember something about the relationship between the Arabs and the Iranians. The Iranians are not Arabs. Islam is an Arab movement. You could regard it as a movement of Arab imperialism. But the Iranians are not Arabs. They are Persians. Once upon a time, there was a Persian empire. It was massive. It was massive from 600 BC until roughly 660 AD. That's a long time. And at one point, one of the Roman emperors, there was a big superpower thing. It was like the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, except it was between the Persian Empire and the Roman Empire. And at one point, one of the major Roman emperors decided to lead an army himself and finally defeat Persia. Do you know what happened to him? The Persians killed him, and then they flayed him. They took his skin off, and they inflated it and stuffed it like a balloon. And I'm not sure what they did with what was left, whether they sent it back to Rome or what. But the Persians were such a mighty empire that they could even humiliate the Romans. And the Arabs are still aware of that history of the Persians. And so the Saudis, that's another reason the Saudis are scared to death of the Persians. But the Saudis think that the Persians have been masters of lying from 600 BC onward for a very, very, very long time. So the Saudis, another reason the Saudis quit that seat at the United Nations, they are so angry at Barack Obama and John Kerry, you wouldn't believe it. Because in their view, the United States and Saudi Arabia have been bosom buddies since at least 1948. They've been bosom buddies in particular since the Arab oil embargo of 1973. Because since that oil embargo, in which, of course, they sort of flayed us alive by increasing the price of oil by such a dramatic number that it defies belief, and that's where they began to get their real money. It was in the Arab oil embargo of 1973. Nonetheless, the Saudis have played along with us. They haven't played along with us. They've been very close to us, and they have made sure that oil prices never went so high that they would damage the American economy. And they have been very good about that. And they feel that they have been our best ally in the Middle East. And now, here the Iranians are in danger of encircling them and engulfing them. And encirclement in international law is considered a legitimate cause for war. And they feel encircled right now by the Iranians. And we seem to be falling for the Iranians' lies, because what the Iranians have done is they tried Ahmadinejad, who used a lot of rhetoric against us, and that didn't help. They got a lot of sanctions thrown at them. Now they're trying the opposite approach. If you can't catch them with vinegar, catch them with honey. And that's what Rouhani, the current prime minister, is all about. He's not there to make any actual concessions when it comes to nuclear weapons, not at all. He is there to take advantage of the fact that we are all exhausted with this business of being in a state of perpetual arousal, in a state of perpetual alarm, in a state of perpetual stress, in a state of perpetual conflict. And he's offering us the rhetoric of peace with the knowledge that we will fall for the rhetoric and not look below the surface, that we will trust without verifying. That's what seems to be happening right now, because they are not planning to make any concessions. You notice there was a big story in all of the American papers in the last few days about how the Iranians have pulled back on their nuclear program. Well, pulling back means they've now got 18,000 centrifuges, 18,000 centrifuges, making nuclear fuel. That they built 5,000 centrifuges in the last 9 months. But in the last 3 months, they stopped building new centrifuges and only put 5 new centrifuges in motion. That is, over the course of 6 months, they built 5,000 centrifuges. And then for 3 months, they laid off and only inaugurated 3 new centrifuges. Well, it takes time when you build new equipment to incorporate it. And if you're clever and you have to stop because, you just stop. They're not stopping. Those centrifuges are spinning at this very second, turning out nuclear fuel, turning out 20% enriched uranium, which is very close to the 90% enriched uranium you need to make nuclear weapons. Very, very close. That's why Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel is so nervous. But the people who are the most nervous, the people who feel that these weapons threaten them the most, are the Saudis, and they are furious. And one of the reasons they stomped away from that UN seat was to let us know how pissed off they are at us right now. And the other was to keep what they've paid so much money to achieve. But they've spent $80 billion in PR and lobbying money to achieve. to keep their invisibility. Does that all make sense? I mean, we are talking hundreds or thousands of sources right now, and they are not Western sources. They are Saudi sources, Iranian sources, Egyptian sources, South Asian sources, Pakistani sources. And they are the original sources on the history of Islam. Ibn Ishaq and al-Tabari, the first men to ever write history, the history of of Muhammad himself and of the growth of the Muslim empire. Because another bizarre thing that it's very important to understand is that the last 10 years of his life, Muhammad spent in a state of constant conquest. And their Saudi literature will tell you exactly how many hectares he conquered every single day. And he built a system where he conquered one wealthy Jewish town, and instead of killing all the men, which he'd done with another wealthy Jewish town, allowed some of the men to stay as long as they tilled the land and gave half of what they tilled over to him, so he could go from having a seasonal army to having a full-time army. And that helped. And when he died, before he died, at 628 AD, 4 years before he died, he sent out what are called the letters to the emperors. I mean, they're called that in Islam. And the letters to the emperors were letters to the 6 biggest emperors he could find. In his view, they ruled the entire world. And first you have to know a story. According to the Hadith, which are the Hadith are the eyewitness accounts of Muhammad's life from those who lived with him. And they were taken down after his death, and they're holy in Islam. And according to the Hadith, God came to Muhammad and laid a rolled scroll in front of him and said, unroll that scroll, and said, that is a map of the world, and you shall have all of the world to the east as far as it goes, and you shall have all of the land to the west as far as it goes. In other words, I'm giving you the planet. After that happened, Muhammad sent out his letters to the emperors. They were called invitations to Islam. In essence, they said, I'm inviting you to Islam, which is the one true religion, and I'm a guy named Muhammad, and I'm the only prophet who has ever been true to this particular religion, even though it's been handed to 1,200 other prophets, but it's been mangled in the versions that they've given out. And I've got the only real version, and either convert your people to Islam, or I will be forced to inflict the consequences. Now, according to Islamic history, when the emperor of Persia, remember that's Iran, when the emperor of Iran saw this, he said to one of his chief advisors, who the heck is this Muhammad guy, and what people does he come from? And according to, again, the Muslim historians, Chosroes is the name of the emperor. Chosroes' chief minister turned to him and said, Your Highness, don't worry about it. This is a people so small you can compare them to desert fleas. They don't even have a proper name. He was talking about the Arabs. They're off in the desert so far away from anything of significance to anything to humanity, that you will never, ever hear of them again. Well, guess what? Within 150 years of Muhammad's death, not only had Islam conquered every single one of the 6 empires to whom Muhammad had sent a letter, they had conquered a territory 11 times the size of the conquest of Alexander the Great, 5 times the size of the Roman Empire, the size of 5 Roman empires, and 7 times the size of the United States. 13,500 miles across, going all the way from the Atlantic coast of Africa to Indonesia and Malaysia. No empire in the history of the world has ever done that. The English Empire, which was famous for the fact that the sun never set upon it, never came anywhere close to that. Carolyn Elkind, who bills herself at Harvard as the world's leading historian on empire, on imperialism, says no empire in the history of the world has ever been able to win the hearts and minds of the people it conquered. Well, just go ask the people in the 6 northern provinces of Nigeria on the Atlantic coast of Africa who live under Sharia law voluntarily. Ask them whether they're still faithful and loyal to this Arab religion that was brought to this earth by Muhammad. Ask the people in Aceh, Indonesia, or in Kuala Lumpur, the capital of Malaysia, whether they are still faithful, loyal, and true to the religion that was brought to them by this group of what the Persian emperor would have thought of as desert fleas. And they are. They will lay down their lives for that religion. So we're talking about a background of a history that we don't know and have never been taught. It's not taught in our schools. And current events in that world that we do not know because the Washington Post, the New York Times, AP, and Reuters do not tell them to us. And it brings us right back to the subject of where we started. If a nation's legitimacy is based on the informed nature of its populace, then we are walking around with a lobotomy. And if an individual's ability to make wise decisions about her life or his life is based on his or her ability to see into the secret corners of the seven selves who are always contending invisibly for control of our next action, our next thought, and our next emotion, if knowledge is the key to wisdom, then we need knowledge to be all that we can be. We need knowledge as a nation to be all that we can be. We need knowledge as a civilization to be all that we can be. And the heroes of information and knowledge are Edward Snowden and Bradley Manning.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, Howard. I often when you speak, I feel like I'm standing in a wind tunnel now, looking at myself, thinking, oh, you've blown all of my clothes off. I'm standing in my underpants, picking up scraps of my, intellectual dignity, thinking, where do I go from here? I want to ask you, 10 questions about the future of the destabilized Middle East and what you think. But I also wonder, so I'll give you the other option, and maybe you can take us where you want to go, because like all good Hollywood movies, we've gone very big, but I'd like to do the right thing and also make this a personal story. I'd like to go small in some way. And so there was something I was going to ask you. I've been doing a bunch of writing about this strange concept of whistleblowing, and I know you've always been fascinated by the sort of up and down the holonic scale from the individual to the family to the governmental to the global brain, which was always an idea that just illuminated me. And for me, it seems that whistleblowing as well is not so much something that individuals do as much as it is an archetypal process of life itself, a moment that a fragment of a larger whole reveals information about that larger whole that literally has the power to systemically reconfigure it at a higher level of integrity and sophistication. The only problem being that it means a process of death and rebirth in the reconfiguration process that the larger whole historically does not want to go through. And so for me, that seems to be somewhere where we're at, not only in a corporate environment where whistleblowing really exploded, but also at a governmental level. And then at this personal story, really on an individual level, even at a family level, like the whistleblower in our own psyche that dares to look over that edge into the abyss of our own unconscious concrete bunker, be it
knowledge is everything. Why you and I, okay, Zach, I might have put you through this when you came to visit me a year and a half ago. But try putting your left finger, index finger through your palm and see if it goes through.
I'm not dreaming. It only happens in a dream.
Yeah, so it doesn't go through, right? Okay. Now, how old are you? Let's put it differently so you don't have to answer precisely. Are you less than 100 years old?
Yes.
Okay. Now, how old is the stuff that kept your finger from going through your palm?
About 14 billion years.
You got it, 13.77 billion years old as of the latest figures from 2 months ago. Because it's protons. It's protons and electrons and the peculiar dance they do when they're in each other's company. You and I are the first piles of protons, and other humans. Humans are the first piles of protons, capable of dreaming, capable of thinking, capable of reflecting, capable of writing books, capable of doing radio shows. We are the cosmos' way of getting to know herself. And the cosmos has this funny ability, and it relates to the life and death stuff, the birth and resurrection image that you alluded to a minute ago. Mm-hmm. Cosmos has this funny ability to re-sculpt herself, to remake herself, to recreate herself in dramatic and astounding ways. I mean, once upon a time there was no cosmos, and then we had an infinitesimally tiny little pinprick, and it came blatting out in space and time. That's a radical change. It's a radical change from nothingness to a pinprick, and it's an even more radical change from a pinprick to space and time, especially considering that space and time was moving at super speed, and there'd never been space, there'd never been time, there'd never been speed before. Well, now, if you and I had been sitting around at a coffee table at the beginning of the universe, and you were the visionary, and I was the crusty old fart, and you had said to me,
Thank you.
Yes, see that spreading sheet of space and time? And I say, yeah, Zach, I've been watching it for as long as it's been in existence. And you'd say, any 10 to the minus 30 seconds of a second now, it's going to precipitate the way that raindrops precipitate like a storm cloud in things. And I would look at you so funny, Zach, and I would say, Zach, what have you been, what kind of paleo cactus have you been eating recently? What have you been smoking? We've been here since the beginning of this thing. All we've ever seen is space and time. That's all there were, and speed, and that's all there ever will be. Now, think of this logically, Zach. Think of it in Aristotelian terms. Garbage in, garbage out. Add 1 plus 1, and all you get is 2. Add space, time, and speed to space, time, and speed. You don't get things. In fact, Zach, why do you think this place we've been sitting at having coffee forever is called the nothing? No thing. Get it? There have never been things. There never will be things, and all of a sudden, blat. The universe blats out gazillions upon gazillions upon gazillions of the first things. They're quarks and leptons. The point is, every single one of these transitions from a nothing to a pinprick, from a pinprick to a spreading sheet of space and time, from a spreading sheet of space and time to the very first things, these are radical reconstructions. These are radical remakes. This is not a universe that snoozes, that sits there content with what she's done. She's constantly, discontentedly making something new. And she's making new stuff right now through you and me. She's making new stuff right now through our conversation, through a zillion conversations, knitting together like threads in a piece of cloth and a piece of fabric. The Founding Fathers had a sense of this. They had a sense of it even though they didn't have any of the metaphors and any of the scientific knowledge that we just alluded to. Nonetheless, they had a sense of this when they decided that you could base an entire country not on a king who got his sense of control directly from God and his legitimacy directly from God, but on a populace that was well-informed, that read newspapers, that thought, that read books. Well, we've gone well beyond books. I mean, to me, once upon a time, my parents, when I was 10 years old, took us on a car trip across the country from Buffalo, New York, all the way to Mexico and California, and we stopped at a place called Carlsbad Caverns. And Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico is remarkable because it has this entranceway that's, must be 150 feet high. It's like a cathedral opening. And because it's so high, this huge opening, the light, the sunlight goes in what seems to be a tremendous distance. Yet it turns out, if you read the history of the place or you listen to the guides, there are hundreds of miles of tunnels underneath and around that place. And aside from that big opening that's in the light, all of it is in utter darkness. And if you haven't invented some form of light, if you haven't invented a candle, if you haven't invented a torch, if you haven't invented a flashlight, and you try to go into those tunnels, you're screwed. You're fried. You'll get nowhere. Well, the human mind is like that, and we've only begun to explore that big cathedral-like opening, and Freud began to inch us into the back rooms, the vaults, the snaky, worm-like threads of it. Back in roughly 1900, when he took a word that had been around for 20 years but nobody had paid attention to, called the unconscious and the subconscious, and he began to popularize them. We have a long, long way to go to understand our own minds. We have a long, long way to go in our symbolic representations of the cosmos in which we live, not just symbolic representations in books and newspapers, the things that they had in Jefferson's day and Washington's day, but in bits and bytes, in computers and hard drives and cloud drives and all kinds of stuff like that. And every time we inch our way into that darkness with some new piece of equipment to give it light, and every time we represent the universe around us by using the light of another symbol set, language, books, hard drives, we are expanding we're expanding the cosmos. We are giving the cosmos things the cosmos never had before. And the cosmos is a funny thing with herself. She finds ways of taking bits of herself, folding them over upon themselves, and making radically new things. She did that when she folded time, space, and speed upon itself and made the very first things, the quarks and the leptons, and she's doing it with us right now with information. And the more we know, the more we can do the universe's work of her next unbelievable acts of creation. And the less we know, the less we will be a part of that process. And if we are ignorant, there are others who will flee from ignorance into the light, who will go where we did not dare to go, and who will be the civilizations beyond us. And I want us to be the civilization beyond us, because I admire freedom of speech. I admire many of the things we stand for. There are many things that are bad. I want to be among those who cleanse us of those bad things and take us into the light. I don't want the Chinese. I want to get as much light as I can from the Chinese, and I want to give them as much light as we can. But I want us to be a major civilization in the coming century.
Yeah, thank you, Howard. Well, once again, there are several ways to go. Maybe I'll give you a pick and mix, and you can decide. Because as you're talking, my brain is going in 20 different directions. I'm interested in your thoughts on, with regards to the picture you painted, what is going to happen with Palestine and Israel? What's going to happen with Iran? What's going to happen with Egypt and Syria? I'm not done yet. What's going to happen with the war on whistleblowers? JFK director Oliver Stone just, I believe, released an entire campaign about that. I mean, to say nothing of journalism. I won't ask you about the environment. We know we're screwed.
Well, let's start here with the whistleblowers. I went up back. This is going to sound like a terrible confession, but it took me 3 years to figure out how I really felt about Bradley Manning. My conscious brain said I disagreed with what he had done, and yet my conscious brain knew something was wrong, and that it should never make that statement out loud because there was something wrong. And what I finally figured out about 4 or 5 months ago was the something wrong was that, we talk about the 7 different cells, most of which proceed in darkness, and my gut brain felt that everything Bradley Manning had done was right, necessary, and heroic. And it took 3 years for my gut brain to manage to articulate itself. And once it did, I knew it was right. Sometimes there are things that you know are right in your muscles, your bones, your guts, that your conscious brain, your verbal brain has a much more difficult time arriving at. And once I realized just how right Bradley Manning had been and how necessary what he'd done had been, I went up on whitehouse.gov to find the petition to free Bradley Manning. I mean, crazy as it sounds, to free Bradley Manning, somebody must have written that petition. And
incidentally, Howard, we should be calling her Chelsea Manning.
Oh, Chelsea. Okay, but at the time, Chelsea Manning was still known as Bradley Manning. That was before he made the Chelsea request. But at any rate, so I went up on whitehouse.gov to find the petition so I could sign it. And thank you for correcting me, by the way. And I did not find it. So I wrote one. It only got about 16,000 signatures, but fortunately Edward Snowden was in the headlines, and somebody else had put up a petition for a similar thing with Edward Snowden, and there's a correlation, Zach, if you watch these petitions, between the number of headlines and the numbers of signatures you get. On days when there were headlines about Edward Snowden, that petition for Snowden would get a lot of signatures, and on days when Snowden had disappeared from the headlines, it would get very few, which means there's a lesson in that for you and me. If we really believe powerfully about something, we have to continue being activists for it, even on days when no one else seems to be paying any attention. But at any rate, we have to all be activists. We all have to let the world know in every conceivable way we can with our limited abilities that these guys are heroes. And Barack Obama, who's my president, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat. And I want the Medicare program, or whatever it's called, the Obamacare program, which is really what's his name care from. It's really a Republican plan, but we won't go into that. I want his health program to succeed, and we could go into that for another program. I am with him in many ways, but not with lying, and not with coddling this culture of secrecy. Not at all. And those of us who believe in either direction have to be activists on behalf of our beliefs, period, to the best of our ability, because our nation is at stake here. This is a nation based on freedom of information. This is a nation based on freedom of the press. And why was I so embarrassed when I realized that I was jumping up and down with Nancy Kissinger about a dead solid truth, the sock puppet war between Saudi Arabia and Iran in Syria. And I was embarrassed because I was standing there 10 feet away from the two people who at that point owned the Washington Post. I should not have been embarrassed. They should have been embarrassed. Sorry, I'm getting a little emotional. But this stuff counts. This is the stuff that life is made of. You and I are put here to make a difference. And it's only people like us who've ever made a difference. Do you know how depressed Winston Churchill was? The guy who saved Western civilization, he called it his black dog, his depression. He was depressed.
The black dog.
Yeah, he could not sleep like a normal human being. He had been disgraced. People in polite society wanted to have nothing to do with him for 10 years. He called those his years in the wilderness. And he saved Western civilization as we know it anyway. Hey, and not to mention the noises he made when he was in the bathroom trying to defecate. I mean, and all these little things that happen to you and me that we're not supposed to confess, that we're supposed to pretend don't exist. Well, hey, it's just little people like you and me who've ever made history. Even Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar were just little vulnerable people who sometimes itched at the wrong times and were tempted to scratch it and had to remind themselves, hey, I'm running a triumph here. That's not going to look good. Just very vulnerable people, and we have to gather our invulnerabilities, our beliefs. There's nothing invulnerable in us at all. But we have to gather our strengths, even though we don't believe we have them, and we have to push for all we're worth to work on behalf of the things that we believe are important and true. That's an absolute obligation, and it's hard some days. It's maybe hard every day, but we have to do it anyway.
I see an incredible shift still in the world, and I'm sure you do too. Just maybe to end on that note, every time I look around, I mean, you've just come out with this ebook, I believe, called How I Accidentally Started the 60s, which I'm halfway through, and it's just a delight. And, that was such a special time. I mean, I often look back, obviously I wasn't born in the 60s, but I look back historically to that time, and it really, something fundamentally changed in the cultural consciousness, certainly of the West. I mean, LSD alone just sort of was like an ice pick that just pierced through the world that James Dean was screaming at and saying, you're tearing me apart, the whole Stepford Wives, Mad Men type of superficiality, and something really pierced through in the 60s, and I often see it as a sort of a 6 a.m. wake-up call that a few visionary individuals got out of bed and started the day. And now it feels like it's almost midday, and a huge, larger number are sort of wiping their eyes and rubbing their eyes and actually, getting out of bed and starting at 2. I mean, it does feel like that from where I'm standing. Does it feel like anything like that from where you're standing, Howard?
To me, it feels like a salmon struggling its way upstream, and you just have to keep struggling. And it's hard to say there have been huge shifts in my lifetime. Zach, I have this enormous privilege. You know, okay, today I only did 299 push-ups. I hate to disappoint you. But 3 weeks ago I did 520 for the first time in my life. This is without stopping. And I'm 70 years old. Well, one of the great benefits of being 70 years old is you've seen so many changes. And in the 1960s, well, the television was around and the radio was around, and those played major roles in my life. And in the spiritual enlightenment, there's a spiritual enlightenment story in the book, How I Accidentally Started the 60s, which, by the way, is available at smashwords.com. But at any rate, in How I Accidentally Started the 60s, without the radio, I would never have heard Aldous Huxley. Aldous Huxley was giving a series of lectures called The Doors of Perception. It was about the impact on his life of mescaline and LSD. Without the radio, I never would have heard that. I was certainly going to never see anything about that on television. And in fact, if I hadn't been living on the Canadian border where we could get the BBC via the CBC, I never would have heard about that either. Today, life has changed so dramatically. I'm talking to you on a cell phone because my landline wouldn't work. Sitting in front of me is my laptop computer. When I was 12 years old, I co-designed a computer that won science fair prizes. But in those days, 12 years old, that's 1955, in those days a computer was the size of a building. With the idea of owning one yourself, ridiculous. So we have these new tools. You know, we have this concept of being an informed citizenry that we got in 1776 because of the magic of the printing press and the newspaper and language and the alphabet and a bunch of other things. Today we have such incredible new instruments for the doors of perception, such incredible new instruments for the kind of deep knowledge that you and I are talking about, that it's ridiculous. But you're right. It is time to bring back that spirit of adventure in the deepest realms of the spirit and put them together with the deepest realms of the intellect and the deepest realms of what's practical scientifically and of what's practical technologically, because things have changed so dramatically in just the last 30 years. Those things are ready for a brand new mix. And I think that Daniel Pinchbeck, you know his work?
Absolutely.
Trying to do that. Yeah, well, Daniel, who's another friend of mine, I think Daniel's trying to do that, but I try to put more of the hard sciences into it, and especially more of the knowledge of what's really going on in the geopolitics of the real world around us, along with physics and genetics, because all these areas, you know, have been very vitally important to me all my life.
Yeah. And they're all interpenetrated.
And so the more knowledge you cluster into yourself, the more you can comprehend, and the higher your let's call them, for lack of a better word, the higher your spiritual aspirations at the same time, and the more you can not allow those spiritual aspirations to distract you from the strange little subtleties that take place between you and your friends, and especially you and whatever person you have the closest relationship on the planet to. I mean, because marriages and dating relationships and stuff like that can get really gnarly, and all kinds of things that you're not aware of you're doing can throw themselves in the path. Well, your job is to open your eyes and see them, to see all the strange little monsters that come crawling out of you, because from knowledge of those monsters comes wisdom and the ability not to hurt the other person.
Well, Howard, it's always a pleasure. I can't tell you, it's just a joy to bask in the high velocity of your wind tunnel and just enjoy.
Well, it is a pleasure for me too, Zach, because all this energy that you're hearing on this end of the phone, that comes from the interaction between the two of us. And I'm looking forward to the next time we take a walk in the park.
Yeah, me too. And, for those of you who are interested, it's howardbloom.com. I can't give a better endorsement than just to say, read everything Howard writes. It's important stuff. It certainly has enriched my life. So, I hope to do so again soon, Howard, and thank you again.
Well, it's